the big teach-in here on the WTO that set us to go into Seattle to protest. Although we're in really hard economic times and more to come, there's opportunity in this moment. And it's that opportunity that has brought all of us here together today. It's that opportunity. I'm Lori King with Jobs with Justice. I'll be your MC for today. Thank you to the 57 groups who have sponsored this town hall and made it possible. 57 groups, including unions, churches, human rights groups, cable radio, and I just want to give a special shout out to Alliance for Democracy, the first co-sponsor. Very special gratitude goes to the Economic Justice Action Group of the First Unitarian Church and to the entire First Unitarian Church for being such excellent partners in making today happen, and also for being our hosts today. So let's round of applause for the First Unitarian Church. During the reception, which will happen at the end of the day, be sure to check out the tables downstairs of the many different organizations, including my personal favorite, Jobs with Justice, a coalition of community and labor groups built on solidarity. You can even sign a pledge card there. So what are the goals of today's huge gathering? First goal is to bring people and campaigns together that will be part of the solution to this crisis. You'll hear much more about that in the breakout sessions as well. The second goal is to educate ourselves about the roots of the crisis and the scope of the solutions that we need to fight for. Third goal is to inspire us, to let us know and to reaffirm that another world is possible. Fourth, it's to have a good time with great people and great food and great conversations. This town hall is dedicated to the memory of Tom Bernard, a longtime peace and justice activist and a man who worked very hard on this town hall and who died recently. His thoughts, his ideas, his work, his spirit are in this event today. So, I ask you, does the corporate elites and the media elites want us to understand what's really going on with the economy? No. Do they want us to understand economics? No. No, they don't. But we're going to. So here today we have with us economics professor from Lewis and Clark College, Marty Hart-Landsberg. Marty?
Well, I'm very honored to be here, and it's inspiring to be part of this activity. I have the job of starting off with the hard negative parts, and the inspiration parts are going to come later, and so I'm going to be sticking around too, because I think we're all in for a long haul and a tough fight, but I think a fight that we can win. And I guess the starting point is to say the obvious: we are in serious economic trouble. You can tell from the rising unemployment, the homelessness, the hunger, the economic insecurity, the cutbacks in social program. And there's no doubt in my mind that if we don't organize and take action to shape a radical restructuring of our economy, our future looks very bleak indeed. And as Lori said, one of the biggest challenges we face is that I don't think we have a clear collective sense of the nature of the problems we face and the causes of the problems we face. And I think without that, we are going to have a hard time mounting the kind of campaigns we have to. We're bombarded with all sorts of explanations about what's going on. And these explanations largely mislead us. For example, there are people who are saying, well, the crisis is just part of the normal ups and downs of the system. In fact, this recession is good for us. It purges us of our excesses, and then we're going to be better off somehow for it. Obviously, a more serious position is one that's coming out of our new government. President Obama recognizes we have a recession. and that we need to act, and he's proposed an $825 billion stimulus package, which he says will help end the recession and get the economy back to its health. Well, the first position is obviously silly, and it doesn't take a lot of time to show that waiting around for this thing to end on its own is healthy for us. But the problem is that the Obama government's proposal also is not a good solution. It's not bold enough in the short run to really deal with our recession, and it's not bold enough in the long run to really begin the process of restructuring to create a new economy that will really work for us. And to appreciate why I say that, I want to give you some sense of what I understand as the causes of this crisis, and therefore the kind of solutions we have to be thinking about. And I want to start my story about the causes of the crisis back in the decades of the 1950s and 60s. In broad brush, this was a time when the economy was growing, when there was growing employment, when wages for working people were going up, when inequality was slowly beginning to come down, poverty was starting to come down. And corporations were generally willing to pay these wages and to support these social programs and hire people because they enjoyed kind of an effortless superiority coming out of World War II. And it didn't seem to jeopardize their profits, and so they went along with those things. But that superiority wasn't going to last, and it didn't last. And gradually, by the mid to the end of the 1960s, things were changing. Third world countries, for example, that have been exploited for corporate benefit were beginning to resist, eventually raising prices and engaging in wars of liberation. Developed countries that we had helped to rebuild for corporate benefit, like Japan and Germany, had rebuilt and were now beginning to export products into the U.S. market. And the result of rising prices for goods like oil, growing full employment fueled by the war, growing competition from other corporations and other countries meant that profits started to be squeezed in the United States. And corporations didn't like it, and they began to see the expansion and the rising wages of workers and occupational health and safety and environmental issues as threats to their future. And in response, over the decade of the 70s, U.S. companies tried to restore their profitability, and they turned first to the U.S. working class. And they tried to push down wages. And workers generally resisted. And what you had was kind of a stalemate. And the result was the U.S. economy began to slide. We had growing trade deficits. We had growing budget deficits. We had a collapsing dollar. We had deindustrialization. Clearly something needed to be done. And now we come to the decade of the 1980s, which is a very key period for understanding the restructuring that's taken place and for understanding the roots of the current crisis. By the end of the 1970s, business leaders had come to the conclusion that stronger action was going to be needed. And what they had in mind was a violent restructuring of both international and domestic relations. And the government, which was committed to their profitability, led the offensive for them. And here I'm just going to focus on the domestic activities. But as you may remember, the 1980s began with the government using tight money and high interest rates to generate a very severe recession at the start of the decade. And that recession created very high rates of unemployment and weakened the labor movement. And that effort was followed with direct attacks on labor unions and social movements and social programs, all designed to roll back popular power. And by the end of the decade, those things worked. Workers were weaker, social movements were weaker, the whole terrain had changed. And the result was that earnings for working people start to slide, and there was also a growing concentration of income at the top, because even though growth wasn't so great, more of the income was now going to the top because of the weakness of the institutions and power of working people. This was the start of a very important trend that has only intensified. For example, right now, wages and salaries as a share of national income are at their lowest point in the history of record-keeping going back to 1929. And profits as a share of national income are at their highest point. In Oregon's experience, from 1979 to 2004, the average household in the bottom 60% is actually poorer now than they were in 1979. The next 20% broke even. All of the gains basically have been in the top 1%. 2 years ago, 44% of all the net income
income created in Oregon went to the top 1% of households in Oregon. Okay. This is a process that's built. Another thing happened as a result of this offensive. The high interest rates that were used to generate the recession attracted a huge inflow of money into this country from abroad, seeking these high rates of return. This boosted the growth of the finance sector. And this was strengthened by the fact that working people who were seeing their incomes fall started to use credit cards and other debt to try and keep their consumption up. And so what happened was that finance started to become a more and more important part of the economy. And U.S. business began to gravitate towards making money in finance, jettisoning manufacturing in this country. And this was the start of another important trend that we are now stuck with. And so, for example, to highlight this, the profits of financial companies in the United States accounted for only 5% of total after-tax profits in 1982. It's now over 40%. Over 40% of all after-tax corporate profits are generated from the finance sector. Now, this process of inequality and financialization happened slowly. It didn't happen all at once. But as it developed over the 1980s, it sort of began to pick up speed, but it didn't create a very sound economy, as you can imagine. And so by the end of the 1980s, we had a stock market crash, we had a savings and loan crisis that was tied to a mini housing boom, and the economy fell into recession in 1990. At this point, even after the recession, the economy was not very strong. No one was celebrating the U.S. economic model. We were into a period of fairly serious stagnation, with unemployment rising even in the expansion, with real wages falling, with a lack of investment. But things changed very dramatically beginning in the mid-1990s. In an effort to get the economy going, the U.S. government lowered interest rates dramatically. That made it cheaper to borrow money. And people began to borrow more money, strengthening the financialization of the economy. And what happened was essentially this gave rise to a series of bubbles. First, a stock market bubble that started in 1996, and then, of course, a housing bubble that we're slowly seeing the end of. And these bubbles supported a debt-based, consumption-driven expansion that lasted over a decade, from about 1995-96 to 2007. It's important to remember that a lot of economists celebrated this bubble as the revitalization of the U.S. economy. That the U.S. economy had developed a whole new model of growth that was going to carry us off to the future. Remember, with high tech, we were never going to have a recession again. That we had this whole new apparatus and structure that was going to carry us into the future. And of course, we can see clearly that that's not what happened. The bubbles had to burst. And when they did, we can see the shallowness of what happened. We can see the weakness of that U.S. economy. The point here is that even if we are able to stop the recession, without these bubbles, we return to the period of the 80s and early 90s in stagnation. So imagine that we're just going to go back to a healthy economy after we stop the recession, or this slide ends, is to suggest that we had a healthy economy before we went into this recession. And the fact is that what we had was a growth that didn't even benefit working people when it was going on. From 2000 to 2007, the median income for families fell. But the growth was sustained by debt. And to go back now and to imagine that we can go back, or that we want to go back to that economy is a serious mistake. And it's those things that we'd be encouraged to sort of imagine. So with this sort of broad picture in mind, let me now focus more specifically on this bubble economy. What generated the growth, why it collapsed, why we are now facing what some people say is a very real potential of another depression. So beginning in the 1990s, the stock market started to rise on the promise of this new high-tech world. And as the market went up, people who owned stocks got wealthier. And they started to buy more, and they borrowed more, and it generated some consumption and more jobs. And so the economy started to go up in the 90s. And it didn't take very long before we had a stock market bubble. And I say it's a stock market bubble because profits in the United States started to fall in 1997, but stocks kept going up to the year 2000. Stocks are supposed to represent and move in relationship to underlying profitability. Well, when the economy is declining profit-wise from 1997 to 2000 and stocks are going up, it's called a bubble. There's nothing secure underneath them. But people's cheap money, buying stocks, generating this bubble, kept wealth going up, kept consumption going up, and made people think that the economy was actually strong. And the spending started to spill over into another section, and that's housing. And we began to get the start of a housing bubble. People were wealthier, they wanted more houses, bigger houses, they started driving up the price of houses. That triggered a construction boom, kept the economy moving again. Now, why do I say we started a housing bubble? Because from 1955 to 1995, house prices basically tracked the rate of inflation. But from 1996 to 2002, house prices went up by about 30 to 40% faster than the rate of inflation. So there was a bubble going on. Finally, in 2000, the stock market crashed, acknowledging that profits had been going down. There wasn't anything real to this high-tech boom. And therefore, the economy began to collapse and fell into a recession in 2001. And so the government acted again, lowered interest rates again, tried to get the economy going, made money easy. And so people who could borrow money had money, but where are they going to put it? What was the asset that was appreciating? They weren't interested in investing in the economy, so they put money into the housing market. And the housing bubble took off even faster. And so from 2002 to 2006, prices rose about 30 to 40% faster than inflation again. And all of this kept driving the economy. And as I mentioned, while the economy is going up, median income is falling. Well, if median income is falling, how are these bubbles helping keep the economy going? And here's the critical thing about the debt process that underlie this expansion, which is not something that we want to return to or can return to. The short answer is that people began using their homes as giant ATM machines. Between 2001 and 2007, homeowners took out about $5 trillion in cash when refinancing their homes. If you bought a home for $100,000, prices go up to $200,000, you go to the bank, you refinance, you get $200,000, you pay your $100,000 mortgage, you're left with $100,000 in cash. And people were refinancing and refinancing. At the peak of the bubble, people were refinancing their homes and getting cash equal to about $800 billion. Now I'm going to highlight that for a moment because Obama is talking about a $400 billion a year stimulus. The $800 billion is spread over 2 years. We had about 5 years of $800 billion stimuluses that are gone. And he's talking about a one-time, maybe $400 billion stimulus in each of these 2 years, just to get a perspective on this. Something like 40% of all net job creation in the years 2002-2007 were housing related. But every time people did this to get money, their debts grew. And the debt load became increasingly unsustainable. So for example, mortgage and credit card debt as a percent of household income, disposable income, was only 60% in 1982. It was 130% by 2007. Well, the bubble had to come to an end. Many different reasons. A lot of the loans had low interest rates. They reset. People couldn't pay them. Construction grew, so the supply of houses caught up with the demand. Prices started to fall. The prices of homes got beyond what could sustain a new market, and prices started to fall. And when they started to fall, everything started to go in reverse. No new construction. People's wealth started to go down. They started to cut back on their spending. Construction of homes then stops. People lose their jobs, and the economy starts to unwind. And by December of 2007, the economy was in a recession. And home prices have only fallen about 50% of where they're going to fall if we're going to get back to historical trends. And, we have $3 to $4 million foreclosure notices going out last year and the same amount coming out this year. The housing industry is collapsing, and that collapse has not ended yet. So here's a story that says we have an expansion for these bubbles, and the bubbles finally collapse because they can only be sustained so far, and we have a recession. But that doesn't explain the deep crisis that we're talking about. And to fully understand the nature of the deep crisis, we have to go into the financialization that went underneath this. To fully realize how rotten this economy has become and how substantial the changes have to be. financial deregulation. Okay, what happened? So the finance industry loved the housing bubble. They were making loans to people to buy houses. And in order to encourage it, they started using non-traditional mortgages, something called adjustable rate mortgages. Give you often teaser rates to get people into homes. And then after a couple of years, the rates would zoom up. And at the peak of the housing bubble, about 35% of all mortgages were adjustable rate mortgages. So then they went to subprime mortgages. They would often find communities, particularly disadvantaged communities, and force them to take loans that were 2 to 3% higher than the average rate, or make loans to people who didn't have good credit histories, just to get them into houses at low starting rates or no money down. And at the peak of the bubble, 25% of all mortgages were subprime mortgages. But even more damaging were Alt-A mortgages, affectionately known as liar loans, because mortgage houses didn't even care if you had full documentation of your income. And these were for investment properties, 2, 3, 4 homes. And at the peak of the bubble, about 20% of all the mortgages were these liar loans. And so the loans kept coming out, and the finance companies kept making money, and it kept enabling the house prices to go up. And all this was very profitable. But adding to it was the creativity of the finance sector, encouraged by the deregulation. And why was everything deregulated? Because the only growth in the economy was through this process, so the support of the government was to allow it to happen. It was what was necessary to sustain the growth. So here we get to the securitization process. Finance companies were making their money loaning people money to buy houses. But then they got into a new thing. You know, if we take the mortgage, and we loan people money to get the mortgage, and then we sell it to someone else, we get more money and we can make another loan. And so they began to sell their mortgages. And then they began to take 500 or 1,000 of them and package them into what they called a mortgage-backed security and sell it to someone else. And then you would have the security, and the income would come from the mortgages of these 500 to 1,000 mortgages. And the bond rating agencies didn't do a particularly good job, because the deregulation meant that the banks and the investment houses, which used to be separate, were now joined together. So the banks would make the loans, package 500 to 1,000, give it to their investment arms, who would put it together and then sell it. And then they'd make more money, and they would keep, the liar loans, generating more funds. And because they were selling them, they didn't care what the quality was. So they began pumping these things out throughout the entire economy. So money market funds, pension funds, all sorts of investment houses were buying these things. There were all sorts of other new wrinkles, things called collateralized debt obligations. They would take other assets, package them together with mortgages, throw them out. They created things called structured investment vehicles. These investment vehicles would borrow money from pension funds, from money market funds, and then buy these mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations as their entire portfolio, so the banks could get them off their books, and they were making so much money, everyone was buying stock in them. Right? So you had this massive movement of all these things throughout the financial system, and the faster they could move them, the more profits. And so as a result, the entire financial system worldwide has become infected with these assets, all based on this bubble process. Now, as bad as this is, the kicker was the development of something else called credit default swaps. People were buying these things, and they weren't totally stupid. They said, well, maybe we should have insurance. So places like Lehman Brothers, you remember them? AIG, which we bailed out, started offering credit default swaps. It's insurance. So if the security went bad, Lehman or AIG would pay the money. But this was a deregulated process. It was insurance, but they didn't call it insurance, so it wasn't regulated. And what that meant was that anybody could buy insurance on anybody else's security. So it's like if you buy insurance on your home, and then I buy insurance on your home, and someone else buys insurance on your home, so if your home burns up, we all make money. And that's what was happening. By the peak of the bubble, there were $60 trillion of credit default credit default swaps out. $60 trillion. The entire stock market is $22 trillion. All of U.S. treasuries are $6 trillion. The GDP is only 15 trillion. Okay? And what was happening is that these institutions were more than happy to sell you insurance because you were just paying them money, but they didn't keep anything in reserve. It wasn't regulated. They had no reserves. So when these mortgages went bad and people went to claim their money, these institutions had no money. Lehman Brothers collapsed. AIG had to be bailed out. There are shoes waiting to fall all over the financial system. So you can see that what happens when the housing bubble collapses and the economy starts to go down in the finance market. First, you have people who can't pay their mortgage, they leave their homes, the mortgage-backed securities lose their value. Suddenly, everybody who's holding these assets find that they're not worth anything. They start to worry about the value of their investments in money markets and other things. They start pulling their money out. Many of these financial institutions don't have the money there. Lehman Brothers, for example, held a lot of these mortgage-backed securities, held these collateralized obligations. When they start to collapse, everybody gets nervous. And they say, well, who's holding these things? Well, I'm going to get my money out of my money market. I'm going to get my money out of my pension fund. I'm not going to loan anybody money because I don't know when they're going to be next. And so the credit system starts to lock up. And then when the recession hits and businesses start finding their earnings going down and they're desperately seeking loans, no one wants to loan. And so more businesses go bankrupt. And that's what we have right now. We have an artificially created expansion that lasted for 11 years based on debt and bubbles, underpinned by this greedy financial process, which was a response to longer-term stagnation problems, and it's all unraveling. And for this whole last year, the U.S. government denied we had a problem. Until November of 2008, they denied we were in a recession. Right? Well, it may be rough patch. And then when President Bush gave his farewell address, he said, you know, I was pretty shocked when my economist told me we may be headed into something worse than the Great Depression. The fact is, they don't know how bad things are. I don't know how bad things are, but I will say we face a very serious structural crisis. So what the Federal Reserve and the Treasury tried to do first was just sort of bail out these banks, buy up these bad assets. But it was very difficult because they didn't know which ones were bad. They didn't know how much it was going to cost them. So that $700 billion bailout fund that the Treasury Secretary offered didn't go very far, wasn't very effective. So then we started actually taking over assets, buying stock in banks. I don't know if you know this, that we, the public, are the biggest stockholders in Citibank and Bank of America now. We have no voting rights, no power, no authority, but we're the biggest stockholders. Okay, so now we get to the current situation. What should we be doing? How do we think about responses? Clearly, bold action is needed. And now we come to the $825 billion stimulus program. Initially, the President talked, before elected, about that for a single year, which you can see is not out of the question when you can envision the collapsing spending that had kept the economy going. $800 billion just people taking out of their homes. Some 30 to 40% of all consumption over the years 2002-2007 came from these house refinancing. All gone. Okay. People now struggling with huge debts, loss of jobs. This 825, the President says, will be spread over 2 years. 40% of it will be tax cuts, which have very little stimulating power. Half of that for businesses. Okay. This isn't sufficient. It's not enough to really engage an economy that's collapsing very quickly. There's nothing in here about slashing the military budget and putting extended amounts of money into needed state and local government services. There's nothing in here about creating a national health care plan. There's nothing bold about what's going on here. You know, when 1950s, when President Eisenhower talked about transportation, he said, how about a $500 billion highway system? In this stimulus, we have $30 billion for roads and bridges and $10 billion for mass transit spread over 2 years. Okay. This isn't enough. And it's not enough long-term either. The point is that it's not enough to stop a recession with the idea that we're going to return to normalcy, when normalcy, the years before the recession, were years when we all know we were losing health care, fewer and fewer people could afford health care, when services were closing, when we had counties in Oregon with no libraries open. That's not our model. Moreover, as I'm telling you the story, there's no way we can get back there. Those were years of growth based on bubbles that are gone. So what we face, if we accept the economy we have, is a fairly long-term period of stagnation, where things will only get worse. So what we need is something much more bold, and that's something we don't hear about. And the problem is that, as Lori, who introduced this whole event, mentioned, is, you know, there's not an interest on the part of those who are wealthy in talking about something new. And if you think about a stimulus, you don't, yes, jobs, but you don't hear good jobs. You don't hear high-paying jobs. Where's the consumption come from? How are people going to recreate their lives unless we build in a stimulus program that really talks about living wages, about strengthening unions, about new work relations? If you're going to talk about, you don't hear anyone talk about supporting social services with an adequate base, which means taxing the rich and the corporations. I don't know if you know. Two-thirds of Oregon corporations pay only the $10 minimum tax rate that was set in the Depression. But what does the stimulus say? Tax cuts. Okay. We don't hear anything about public planning or public ownership or public production. It was the pursuit of private profit that got us into this situation. Instead of sort of saying, well, we want these things, let's take public money and give it to private enterprise and hope they do what we want, why don't we do it ourselves? If we need mass transit, if we need new generators for the environment, let's take the auto industry, let's take our stimulus and spend the money on our own industry, ensure good jobs, ensure the goods and services we want. If we want weatherization, why don't we take the banks we own and make them give low-cost loans to state and local governments, hire people at good wages to do the work? We don't hear those things. It's not bold enough. It's not going to deal with things. We don't hear anything about the need for a new agriculture food system. We don't hear anything about the need for a radically new healthcare program is a job creation. You create a single-payer system, bring 3 or 4 million new people into the healthcare system, you create jobs and a higher quality of life. We don't hear talk about it. And we don't hear talk about changing our trade system. It's the WTO, it's things like NAFTA, which lead to and have encouraged the imbalance in this economy, creating problems in other places. So one reason this crisis is worldwide is because we've encouraged a system whereby other countries have put all their resources into exporting here, and as we collapse, their economies are collapsing. The problem is that these aren't things that we're going to hear from the media. These aren't things we're even hearing from the president. The primary interest has been to stabilize this system, and that's exactly what we have no stake in doing. So in sum, we can't look to government leaders for solutions, or business leaders for solutions. We need to start organizing and educating and agitating and demanding, and we need to rely on ourselves. And we have a very rich history. We have a rich history from when people talk about the Depression. We have a rich history in the Depression of councils of the unemployed forming, people coming together and saying, we're not somehow the cause of problems. We're unemployed because of social failings. And unemployed people came together and fought for themselves and for other workers and to get Social Security and unemployment compensation. We need to find venues like this one where we come together and acknowledge that the failings that are going on here are not our failings, it's the failings of the system. And I think what's exciting about this event is that it brings us together as an opportunity, as a starting point, as a continuation of developing the confidence that we can think of alternatives, that we realize that what we need are alternatives, and that we have a lot of energy and vision in this room of people who have been spending a lifetime thinking about alternatives. So I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to participating and learning the rest of this day and continuing to work with all of you in the days and months and years ahead to build a decent country and a decent world. Thank you.
thoughtful. I think it's getting us all on a tremendously good start for the next months and years to come. And of course for today. The group here is so huge and wonderful that some people actually didn't get programs when they came in. So more programs were printed up, so be sure, and they're being passed out, so be sure and you do get a program. Just thinking about this town hall and being so inspired, we are also videoing the town hall so that we can make some really cool DVDs and send them to other Jobs and Justice chapters around the country and other groups around the country. We'll get some ideas from you all of who they should be sent to. This may be the first such town hall in the United States. I haven't heard of any others that may be, but there will be cascading town halls through the United States. This is part of our history of struggle. There have been teach-ins in town halls about the Vietnam War. There have been teach-ins about the WTO and civil rights movement, and even back to the populist movement. So it's a very, very strong part of our history. So right now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who will be giving an inspiring perspective, continuing on with what is the scope of the solutions that we need. Not small ones, big ones. What is the scope of the solutions that we must fight for? And to give us this inspiring perspective is Veronica Dujan, who is the chair of the Sociology Department at Portland State University. So please welcome Veronica.
Thank you. It is a very good place to be on a Saturday afternoon. In this environment, one cannot but feel very moved to want to participate to make a better world for us. What we have just heard earlier is that the current economic crisis is a consequence of systemic problems. That much we should understand if we understand nothing else. And to solve the systemic problems that got us into this current social and economic disaster, we need a more sophisticated strategy than one that merely stimulates the economy in an attempt to get us back on the same discredited path we have been on. And from what we can tell, policymakers will need all the help and direction we can give them. A key point of my talk is to make the argument that solving the crisis presents us with an unprecedented opportunity to fundamentally transform the system and make a better world possible. For us to rethink where we are as a society, where we make our investments in terms of our resources, and how we can make the well-being of everyone the focus of our economic activity. To be sure, the challenge is enormous, but so are our demonstrated capacities. We possess the social practices, the technologies, the wealth and working alternatives that we can harness to educate and skill our people, to keep us healthy, to construct a decent social safety net, to reduce huge gaps in incomes, to provide jobs, and to deal effectively with climate change. And I might add that as we do this vital strategizing for our future, we include a serious analysis of how these same dysfunctional economic policies that have been pursued on a global stage in our name have jeopardized the basic survival of people in third world countries and elsewhere. And the best way we can do this, the best way we can harness our capacities is by becoming informed and increasing our democratic participation in politics, in industry, and in daily life. This gathering, our own social forum, is a step in that direction. I have been asked to outline some of the workable, proven, and socially responsible alternatives. A tremendous responsibility. What I do want to point out, as we talk about the stimulus, and the speaker before me was very clear. Given the way we got to where we are in the first place, trying to get back there would certainly not get us out of the trouble we are currently in. In terms of an opportunity and a transformative opportunity, what we really want to think of is what are the fundamentals of any society? What do we need as a community to survive? And if we keep that as the objective, as the focus, then we are in a much better position to move from where we are to where we would like to be. And I would like to argue that it is social investments that our basic infrastructure, our basic social infrastructure, our basic economic infrastructure. What social investments am I talking about? Health, having a healthy, working, skilled population, an educated population, and a well-housed population. And what we do need to remember as we talk about the stimulus package, every dollar spent on creating a job, and we're told in the short term that what we have to focus on is on job creation, every dollar spent on creating a job is not the same as spending on social infrastructure in a vacuum. Every dollar spent generates economic activity. But we want to think, do we want short-term somehow to recover, to be back where we were, or do we want a long-term strategy to form the foundation, the bedrock for a long-term view about where we would like to go? So what we want really is a long-term strategy to sustain future economic and social well-being. And often, it's not as if nothing has been written and we don't understand from our own lived experiences the difficulties we've had over the last decades. We do. But often we would hear, well, the way politics is run, the way government is run at the federal level or the state level, there is not much we can do. That we know what the technologies are, they have been invented, but as long as we have the structures that we do, we cannot make change. Well, this is our opportunity, isn't it? Yeah. This is where everything is crashing down around us, and we have an opportunity to say, look, we know what to do. And since you cannot give us an alternative, we will tell you what we want. And we will. So some of the areas that we need to talk about, and they have been mentioned before, healthcare. Right now, the ability to get access to healthcare is tied to having a job that pays such benefits. This setup has without question failed a huge and growing proportion of the population. It is not good for employers who have to put in their fair share and pay it out. It is not good for workers. It is not good for the dependents of workers. And it is certainly not good for unemployed people. And as we all know all too well, there are certain subgroups of us, particularly people of color and working class families, who are disproportionately affected by such a way of doing things. For a long time now, it has been clear what we have to do. We have to implement a national healthcare system that now almost in fact every industrialized country but we have. The European system, and the argument that we cannot do it or we do not have an example of how to do it is a false one. And the argument that it's only communist countries or a Cuba that has one is a false one. In Western Europe, they have a variety, a spectrum of combination of single payer or non-profit insurers that actually have universal eligibility for half the cost of what we spend in the United States. And compared to the US, they have superior outcomes, including far lower rates of infant mortality and considerably longer life expectancies. And we know from the US Medicare system that it provides an excellent insurance coverage to seniors with the administrative cost just a fraction of what we get from the private insurance. So we do know what to do. So a healthcare system whose expense is now approaching 20% of GDP, yet delivers such poor healthcare, is both eroding our productivity and wasting our resources. Something like a bloated military is what we have in our healthcare system. A lot of healthcare dollars are utterly wasted or prioritize the generation of profit over the taking care of people and people's health. So we know what to do with healthcare. We also know what to do with housing. Housing is quite expensive in the United States because of the landed costs, the labor and the materials. And even for non-profits, decent housing is unaffordable for perhaps a third of the population. Public subsidies and grants, somewhere between 60 and 80 billion a year, is only a small fraction of the military budget. And that, if we had that in housing, we certainly would have decent and environmentally appropriate housing for everyone. And that is what we really want, instead of overspending our resources. And in the short term, in terms of those facing foreclosure, what we need is legislation to create mechanisms for loan renegotiation to reduce mortgage costs to negotiable levels. And the idea that somehow we think that if we're bailing out banks, that is somehow reasonable, because somehow they are the fundamental part of our economy. But if we come to bail out, or not even bail out, renegotiate mortgages, the bureaucracy is just too impossible to track, and it's impossible to do. That is only an excuse. And with an audience like ours, there's quite a lot we can say about the value of working family wage jobs, income, and the security that they provide. This world produces sufficient real wealth to support its entire population if that wealth were more equitably distributed. Raising the income for the global poor, people in poor countries, people everywhere, inside the first world, outside the first world, providing living wages would improve health and the environment across the planet, enhance the livability of all cities, and reduce migration pressure on the destitute. It would reduce population growth, and what we do know about incomes, the connection between incomes, irresponsible resources from an environmental perspective, and population growth, is that when families and when people are adequately taken care of with good wages, good access to healthcare, and good housing, they voluntarily reduce the size of their families. They voluntarily will produce ways of growing agricultural products that will not have the same impact that they are currently forced to have in our current world environment. So if we really want to solve the problem and we want to do it right, what we have to do is to think in holistic and global terms from an environmental perspective and the perspective of taking care of people. We're worried about immigration. Yes, that's a reasonable worry to have if we're going to be the magnet. But think about it. Why are we the magnet? We are the magnet because we are also the magnet for the resources coming out of other countries. People are simply following the pattern of where the resources go. We want to interrupt that. We have to figure a way of how to adjust our very high consumptive lifestyles that, as we understand, create the false bubble that drives our economy. We have to rethink our lifestyles so people in other parts of the world can do just as we do, rethink their resource base and how to best use them, not to feed our habit, but to take care of themselves. Has great benefits in many ways. Greater income equality, and raising income for the poor is good for the economy. And as we know, when we raise incomes at whatever level, especially at the lower levels, not only people consume more and have a better opportunity to educate the kids and take care of the kids, we also increase the tax base. And politicians would be very much interested in increasing the tax base. So you want to increase the tax base, increase family wage jobs, give people a sense of commitment in the places where they are, give them a sense of community, and they will stay, give them the services, and they will pay for it. Or rather, they will pay for the services if they can force you to deliver it. So we have to change our income patterns in all countries so that we do not have corporations draining our resources and we have an upward sucking sound of the benefits of our labor. So as we think about that, and I want to re-emphasize and always come back to the point, the idea is not to just restart the economy as it has been, and as it has been is really pushing a consumer perspective, forcing us to spend as much as we can in a treadmill so that we can keep going with production and generating jobs. When we do it this way, it really exhausts our resources, it changes the climate, it damages the environment, which inevitably undermines the very life-giving ecosystems that we need to survive. So the jobs that we create, the jobs that we're thinking about, we have to think about jobs that do not engage in the same sort of excessive amounts of surplus production of consumer items that really we don't need. So we have to be very conscious of that. In terms of the environment, and I'm trying to bridge over here in terms of talking about what we need in terms of jobs, taking care of people, the social sustainability of our societies, to talking about environmental sustainability. And there's a lot that has been discussed in terms of the stimulus package about having green jobs or paying attention to how we use resources. And these are excellent ideas. What I don't think we talk about much is how we are able to retrofit our economy, retrofit the way we deliver and use energy with technology we already have, technology we already know about. So in fact, today when we talk about sufficient technology in transportation and in energy production, in how we power our factories, in farm machinery, in the cooling and lighting and warming of our homes, and how we produce light and electricity. While some of these, we know that some of these new technologies are relatively expensive, that in part is because they are not widely available. That is also in part because the current sources of energy we currently use are heavily subsidized. Heavily and extremely subsidized. And we know how inertia works in the structural system. The areas that have typically supplied that energy will be extremely reluctant to have any revisiting of how we produce energy and how we supply it. And as you can see, we have several banners up about the war in Iraq and what the resources could be used and how they could be used otherwise. Perhaps in this audience I'm speaking to the choir, but we very well know a lot of the international conflicts we have been involved in from a military perspective has been because of our need for oil and fuel to drive our consumer patterns and to drive our economy. So we are heavily subsidizing with American lives, with the lives of other people, an energy habit that we really have to break, that we can no longer afford to maintain, that we really have to divert these resources into something far more socially responsible. Earlier this month, the New York Times had an editorial on January 19th reporting on a study by McKinsey and some others that argued that last year that most of the carbon abatement needed between now and the year 2030 could be achieved with existing technologies. Things like insulating homes, improving fuel efficiency, and switching to concentrated laundry detergents to reduce packaging and transportation costs. Merely improving the transmission grid for electricity would see a massive payback in terms of capturing that energy for our homes. Fossil fuels now receive considerable tax and other subsidies. Should we remove these? And should we instead push these resources towards renewables, we would go a far longer way in being both responsible to the environment and to citizens and our brothers and sisters in other countries. Now, the talk earlier spoke extensively about the financial system and how we have struggled, us as ordinary citizens, and to certainly a certain extent the politicians trying to come to grips with what they have. We are rightly outraged at the $700 billion bailout that Wall Street got, monies that were wasted on excessive salaries and luxurious parties. And we heard even a couple of weeks ago, in spite of all this information out there, in spite of people's fears and outrage about what has happened, we have certain executives receiving bonus pay in the millions in this environment. It is absolutely obscene. Earlier this afternoon, those monies, however, were not gifts, but stock purchases in the banks and in investment houses that now effectively we own as U.S. taxpayers. The vague conditions that were put on these stock purchases must be strengthened to make them more socially responsible to us, the stockholders. Great amounts have been written by several economists, notable ones, Joseph Stiglitz, for example, Nobel Prize-winning economist. And what are they getting at? They all agree that we are in uncharted waters, and the efforts to create a productive system will have to include a lot of trial and error. Still, no matter what the mix of initiatives that we're considering, they must include tighter controls and regulation, and surely tight restrictions of bank use of public monies. We have already had de facto nationalization, if we want to think about it this way, and direct acknowledged nationalization may be coming soon. If that indeed is the case, then it is our responsibility in fora like this all across the country to make it very clear, as we rethink what we do, how we want our financial system to work. Who do we want it to be accountable to, and what it is our final objectives should be in the end. Now, as we're doing all of this, I think it is very reassuring coming out of the heels of the last campaign that we just had, the last political campaign for presidency, and many would argue that it was very historic. After 8 or 12 years, that people were far more motivated to participate. The turnout at elections, people's willingness to talk to each other certainly has improved. As we go through this transition period, the underlying foundation for what we do and how we do it will depend on how we are informed as citizens and what we know and the extent to which we choose to participate in the decision-making progress. As globalization proceeds, international economic globalization has proceeded, power has been concentrated in big industry, in huge media conglomerates, and corporate managed politics. Democracy can and should be strengthened in both politics and daily life by implementing a host of demonstrably successful democratic forms, like instant runoff voting elections that they're trying out in the San Francisco area. And in the daily life of community assemblies. And for what it is worth, we have perhaps lived for too long as an isolated community. There is a world outside. There is a world of ideas in Western Europe, in Latin America, the African subcontinent, about how to do democracy. And maybe we're coming into this a little bit late. We were certainly very active, and as a people, we have been extremely active at particular points in our history, showing our government where we want to go and how we want to do it. But perhaps if we listen carefully and we look and turn our gaze to the outside, we will notice what has been happening in Latin America. Here we have countries of people, full citizens of people in various countries who had to suffer through a debt crisis of the late 1970s going into the 1980s. And they have been destitute and have struggled for a very long time. And we often think of the third world as a poor zone, region where people do not have options. We have much to learn from them. We have much to learn. We have much to learn about how people who are pushed against a wall, how people who are pushed to the basic survival find the strength and the wherewithal to flex their muscles and tell their governments what needs to be done. So we come to a period in Latin American history, and you can have disagreements over the final policies that are passed or how they are passed, but we look at Bolivia, for example, where in the recent past, coming out of a labor movement, you have for the first time, as long as people could remember from colonial times, an indigenous president who represents more than 80% of the working population, the working poor population of the country, who can stand up and say to the world, we have to nationalize the gas industry because these resources are being a net drain. We do not get the benefits of them. And what do we see in the press? It's being described as nationalization, as if the very thought of nationalization is the worst thing you could do for an economy. I think we're thinking about that now. So we can look to these countries, we can look to Uruguay, we can look to Venezuela, we can look to Chile and the changes that have been taking place. And what we need to remember, people in any country, any part of the world can do this. And we have the luxury of being in a part of the world that is highly educated. And some of us are highly informed, had it not been for the way our media is structured. But that would be one of the things we have to focus on. Giving people an avenue for fair reporting, that they can actually get the information that they need to make up their minds about what to be done, what ought to be done. So it's important to promote democratization as an essential part of the transition. First, because in the absence of a politically astute and vigilant people, the big interests are able to gain more room for their predation. That is, to further extend the list of systemic factors in the current crisis, declining popular involvement creates the conditions for self-serving destructive behavior in finance, healthcare, and wage systems, and we have to make that different. We also have to participate because the planet needs to replace the high consumption, or shall we say, the planet doesn't need to do anything. If we want to continue to survive, we ought to do something. We need to replace the high consumption energy use patterns that we have of pleasure and life, and we have to downsize. We have to contemplate life, what it is we need out of life, what it is as people we actually need. That means that we as people have to change our minds, have to re-examine the whole logic of driving our economy by how much we consume. The way we value each other by how much we owe. And certainly as we think in this time of foreclosures, we certainly have to reconsider, do we all need 4- and 5-bedroom homes with 3.5 baths and a driveway? We also must be conscious of how we do our democracy, because if we want to have the growth that we want, it has to be necessary growth. Growth that enhances people's quality of life and enhances our ability to have better lives for ourselves and our children in the future. So the financial system must be regulated, and much has to be done to control the speculative mania that we've had and instead direct ourselves towards more productive investments. Not just gaming and speculation, but investment that provides jobs, that provides family wage jobs with health care and an opportunity for families to send their kids to school and take care of their kids. So all of this, of course, these are very great ideas, some of them. Some of them we do not need a whole lot of financial resources to engage in, that's the democratic part. But some of the other ideas, we do need the resources. And we're always told there are no resources. Where will the resources come from? As we heard earlier today, the resources that we're talking about pale in comparison to the amount of financial flow, perhaps on paper, that we had in a prior time. But we really have to think very seriously in many of the areas, in many of the arenas where we talk about the availability of resources to do so, to get the resources to pay for the social needs that we have, our social and economic needs. The military is never, a discussion of the military budget is never on the agenda. And we must ask. And what we need to know, it's not that countries, there is not some sort of justification for having a military budget. But what we know from history, militaries are designed for destruction. I mean, that is the objective of militaries. I'm very impressed with the Spanish system as they go through their own transition, that they have actually, as a people, the citizens of Spain, have decided that they will only, or they will make a priority the deployment of the military in cases of humanitarian need, and not in cases of destruction. And of course, we have too much information about waste in the military. We know about how particular companies have operated with no-bid contracts, what they have done. As we've heard before, as we know very well, there's a military-industrial complex, and we have to make it our business as we talk about how to do the things that we need to do so we have a livable community where people are taken care of and an economy that functions in the interest of people. We re-examine and force an examination of what it is we do with our military budget. So, in conclusion, we may not have all the answers, and we may have differences about the answers. What we do know, even as we discuss in the following sessions that we have today at our forum, that there will be lots of good ideas that come up. But these good ideas, we have to make them heard. We have to make our representatives hear them. And as much as some of us might appreciate a new president that talks about the audacity of hope and doing things differently, he will not be able to change the structures of the political system or the way we redirect our resources unless we make him. the afternoon, there are lots of different sessions where people will be in smaller groups to really brainstorm, touch base, find out what's happening. This is, after all, this forum today was organized, one of the leading groups organizing it was for the Jobs with Justice group. And I would like to argue at this point in time, or should I say, I would like to make it clear that one of our key mechanisms for connecting to the wider community, especially from an economic perspective, is the responsibilities we have and the leverage we have as workers. And over the decades, over a number of decades, we have seen a steady decline in union density in the United States. And that we have to fix. If indeed it is through the institution of our connections as workers and our participation in the economy that we have the key entry into leverage into the political system, we cannot let that go. And at any point that we can, we have to reassert our rights as workers via our unions to change the society that we have right now, to be one in which we will be proud to tell our children, I was there in those very dark years, and I participated, and I was part of the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, John. I'm so moved by the fact that we're all here understanding, seeking to understand the economy, seeking to understand our place in history, and getting the permission and space, I think, from our speakers to think about the economy that we need, and not the one that we're told is the best we can get. So it's a very important message to step back and really think about what are our human needs, what are the needs of an economy for a just economy. Thank you very much.
Point of order.
No, excuse me, not now. Sorry. No, we're not doing that now.
This body accept those two brilliant presentations. A second is in order.
We love the presentations and stand by them. Yeah, I mean, it's really what we need. And I just fantasize about the need for mini town halls. Think about that in your neighborhoods, in your union halls, in other churches. This being spread. Veronica started talking about unions, and it's really important. In order to, a big part of the solution to the economic crisis is building union power, and is changing the balance between workers and bosses. And a big way to do that, because it's very unfair now, a big way to do that is to engage in changing labor law, and changing the process of forming unions, which is very unbalanced, very unfair. You'll hear more about that if you go to the workshop, Why Unions? But right now, I'd like to ask everybody, if you haven't already done it, to sign the card that is in the pews, I believe. The cards are about, you're signing a card to support the Employee Free Choice Act, which is landmark legislation that would change the face of labor law and make it much more fair to form a union. Right now, suffice it to say, there's incredible intimidation when workers try to form unions. So if you could sign your cards and pass them to the ends of the aisle to the people collecting them. Good idea, but please, thank you very much. Bring that up in the workshop. There'll be ample time to talk about that. It's a great idea. So if folks would please sign the card, the Employee Free Choice Act card, that would be wonderful. In addition, it's now time to contribute some money, some cash. There are buckets going around. There have been lots of expenses incurred in this process, lots of postage, lots of printing of beautiful programs, lots of food that you'll be able to have in the reception. So there's been lots of money spent. And in the spirit of we're all in this together, please contribute, because we are all in this together. So please contribute. No amount is too small, and no amount is too big. And as you're signing cards and putting some cash in the buckets, I want to explain to you that the breakout sessions have been very carefully planned. There's excellent breakout leaders ready to facilitate breakout sessions. After the breakout sessions, please hurry back here for the conclusion of the program. The conclusion of the program will be inspiring and help us figure out how we can get to some of the wonderful ideas and solutions that both Marty and Veronica pointed out. So do hurry back to close our circle. Also, don't forget that after everything, there's going to be a reception with great food and time to schmooze. So right now, some logistical things, so if I can have everybody's attention. Okay, please get to your breakout sessions by 2:45. You'll have a chance to go downstairs and look at some of the tables, but please get to your breakout sessions by 2:45. We'll have people saying the time also. If you need help in finding the session, it's in your program, and the rooms are in the program. Please look for people with volunteer signs and they'll help you. Okay, everybody, clap if you hear one. Clap if you hear me once. Clap if you hear me twice. Clap if you hear me 3 times. Okay, please listen up. Thank you. Breakout leaders, make sure there's a note taker in your session. There are extra guidelines on the front table. We're also asking for your kindness because we didn't know how many people were going to show up today. So some of the breakout sessions may be kind of squeezed, and you may be squeezed in a little bit, or you may have to take a second choice. Again, we're all in it together. It's great that the turnout is so big. We're thrilled. So just be flexible. If you want to be contacted for future events, which I'm sure a lot of you will, and you haven't signed in, be sure to sign in. So be sure to be at your breakout session by 2:45 and back here by 4:15. Have fun.